Hello and welcome to the American Cinema Foundation Movie Podcast. I am your host, Titus, and today I am joined by Mr. Sonny Bunch, critic extraordinaire. We are going to talk about Zack Snyder and specifically Watchmen, the movie about superheroes and why they're also tragic and also American. First of all, Mr. Bunch, thank you for joining me. Please introduce yourself for our audience and tell us, how do you feel about Zack Snyder?
Hi, everyone. So I am infamous as a Zack Snyder hack, defender to the end, excepting Justice League, which isn't really a Zack Snyder movie. I have a couple of broader thoughts about Zack Snyder, which is that I think that anybody who is able to bring their own personal style to massive big budget filmmaking like we have today is at the very least worth paying attention to. I think, you have your cookie cutter assembly line products like the Marvel movies, which are all very good, but they're all within a very narrow baseline of good. Acceptably done, but not particularly memorable. And they're all kind of sans any real style. None of them has a unique style. Ryan Coogler tried to bring some of that to the Black Panther movie, but I still think it's working very, very much within the standard Marvel method. The Russo brothers have a good sense of action, but they are still just making pretty straightforward action cinema. And again, it's all very well done, but it's not particularly eye-catching or memorable. What Snyder has managed to do is bring a personal aesthetic, and say what you will about the speed ramping, the slowing down and speeding up, but within the milieu that he is working, within the world of comic book adaptations, which is frankly what most of his career has been, it actually makes a lot of aesthetic sense. What he is doing is mimicking the look of a comic book frame. And he's doing it in a way that makes sense for cinema. If you go back and look at the Ang Lee Hulk movie, there are these weird shots where the screen itself breaks up into basically a comic book page with panels everywhere. And your eyes kind of drawn over here, then over there, then over there to make sense of what's going on. Well, that's not doing that sort of thing in film doesn't make as much sense as basically freezing the frame, letting you see the action, then speeding you up and taking you into the next frame. That is an actual cinematic representation of what a comic book page looks like. And this is why I always thought it was kind of funny when he was given Man of Steel. And I think Christopher Nolan, or maybe it was somebody else, said something like, "Don't worry, guys, no slow-mo in this one." And I was like, well, that kind of defeats the purpose. If you're going to hire a guy like this, you might as well let him do his thing. And I think we got back to some of that with Batman vs. Superman. But anyway, what I find interesting thematically about Snyder's work, especially the DC movies, but this goes also back to 300, is this idea of what it would be like if a god showed up on Earth. I mean, the central idea of Man of Steel, all the way through Batman vs. Superman and Wonder Woman, and Suicide Squad even, which is not a good movie, but it's still there, is how would the world change if an actual superhuman, godlike being showed up on planet Earth and, started destroying stuff. I mean, I've never been very fond of the criticism that Man of Steel, is bad because Superman let too many civilians die. I mean, he was trying to stop the literal destruction of the world. Time was a factor. So the idea that he's to blame for all these deaths that were caused by Zod is dumb. But this idea that how would society change? How would our various structures react to it? Like I said, Suicide Squad is not a very good movie, but it's a fascinating film to think about from the perspective of how would the American government respond to the appearance of Superman? And you see a little bit of that in Man of Steel, where the army's kind of like, well, we can't stop Zod, so I guess we got to let Superman do it. But I think there's a certain strain of thought that would be much more like the Amanda Waller strain. We need to figure out how to stop these people at any cost. We need to figure out how to make this go away. And of course, Batman vs. Superman, it's a mess of a movie. The director's cut is better. The theatrical cut's a bit of a mess. But the best part is the opening moments where Bruce Wayne, almost inarguably the most powerful human being on the planet at that point, he's an Olympic caliber athlete. He's a master of martial arts. He's got all the gadgets and toys. And he's also a billionaire. He can buy banks and save people's foreclosed houses. He can do anything he wants. And he realizes that he is actually just an insignificant ant watching the gods battle amongst us up in the sky. The idea there that he would respond to this by trying to figure out how to stop this from happening is an interesting one, and one that makes sense, and one that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's a bunch of stuff that comes together in Zack Snyder that makes him the right kind of artist for blockbusters, for big budget movie making that's supposed to impress people and be memorable, not just an entertainment. One of it is how physical everything looks, and I think that's a very important thing to him, that these people's bodies are incredibly impressive, incredibly strained, and there's a lot of dangerous stuff going on. Partly, I guess it's a matter of attracting people's attention. Partly, I think it's a matter of showing that the beautiful naturally slides into the noble. Do you like Superman because of the pecs, or because he's good, or both, or the power, or is the power both of them? How does that tie up with his splendid suit? They're all somehow tied up together, and otherwise heroes wouldn't really be heroic.
Yeah.
And this inclines him to look on the tragic side of life, and graphic novels and comic books had an unusual penchant for that as well, because it was just much easier in those terms, both of genre and of drawing, to suggest that some things are more than merely ordinary. That's hard to do, partly because of the media we use, and partly because of the way we use it and our assumptions, and partly, of course, because of the way we increasingly turn things into a fairly simple form of politics where you have to pick a hero, you have to pick a villain, and then they have to fight it out in metaphoric wars of words on the internet. So that ends up with everybody's hated. Everybody is hated by at least half the nation. Who's left to be memorable?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you go back and think about 300 and the way that film is actually structured, it is exactly this idea of providing an example for people to follow, right? The film, we watch it in what we can assume to be real time, right? But it's actually a story being told by, I forget the name of the character from Herodotus, but he is telling the story of the 300 to the assembled troops going out to do battle with the Persians, right? This is the framing rubric that he uses. And again, if you think about how 300 looks with these statuesque Greek fighters, it is amusingly historically inaccurate. I mean, the whole reason the Spartans were such an impressive fighting force is because they actually had really good armor and very strong shields, and they fought in the phalanx. Thank you. These men are instead, of course, portrayed as basically abs with heads. And it's this idea of statuesque noble beauty, the good, and there's all sorts of philosophy that I think you're probably more equipped to discuss than I am, but it is a running point of ancient philosophy. The noble and the good are also the beautiful.
Yeah, you admire things that people do. And at least in the case of physical contest, the deeds are seen in the bodies, because somebody has to do something impressive. It's like watching Michael Jordan. You understand that there's a lot of effort, willpower, and so forth, but you see it all in one body. And this is two problems of all our storytelling put together into one. On the one hand, you have to make memorable things that also catch attention. It's gotta be interesting now, but it's also gotta be interesting in a broader sense, or else it'll be forgotten instantly. And aside from this, there's also this other matter. How do you make soul transparent or visible? You don't know what people's intentions are, especially in our world. People appear in very disparate ways in very different places, and they're always moving in and out of frame. How do you ever focus on somebody? How do you ever feel, I know such and such a person is such and such a person? How do you get that moment of recognition? And even more, the sense that somebody's character or what kind of person they are, or ultimately what their soul is, that it can help you predict what they'll do. You get to understand what goes on that way. Our storytelling, I think, for this reason, ultimately has turned around everywhere towards heroes. From computer games to movies for girls, everything is superheroes. I think ultimately because people identify the memorable with the heroic. And at the basis of that is this notion that you can see somebody's character in his actions. It's the 300, they're Spartans. They're ultimately the people who believe that actions speak louder than words. As you pointed out, they too need words. Somebody has to tell their story. But that's the advantage that you get with memorable stuff. You get the sense that you can make things obvious to people that are invisible in real life. And admittedly, 300 has this amazing transformation. All these Spartans instantly turn into Athenians because Americans are like Athenians. They're all the individualism that you mentioned and this individual striving. There's something about togetherness, but there's not that much. They're individualists because Americans are that way.
Yeah.
My favorite scene in 300 is when he kicks the Persian ambassador and kills him, and yells that this is Sparta. No, that's Athens. In the book of Herodotus, both the Athenians and the Spartans kill the Persian ambassadors, but the Athenians high-five each other over it, whereas the Spartans think they've done something horribly impious, and two of them volunteer to go all the way to Babylon to sacrifice their lives, to make amends, because they were pious people. That's how they thought about things. But in the movie, you get this other version. What the Americans do need heroism, but they need it in an American, Athenian mode. The sculpture lists this idea that everybody's bound by the laws together, and that's the old story of the Spartans, that they obeyed the laws and they died. That's the memorial of the 300 soldiers. So he's quite savvy about updating this for an American age.
Well, and it's also worth looking at the things that he added to Frank Miller's story. I mean, basically all of the stuff with the Queen is an addition that Zack Snyder put in. Either, if you were being cynical about this, you could say it was a play to increase the gender representation or some such, which is important in our culture and society. People care about that sort of thing. But also he added I'm pretty sure all of the stuff from the Gerousia, the Spartan government. I mean, it's nonsensical and it's, again, very ahistorical, but it is an addition that is designed to give it that, again, kind of Athenian feel. It is much more the Athenian notion of government and decision-making by a body politic than anything the Spartans had.
Yes, that's very true. And again, these things are supposed to speak to Americans, and so far as I can tell, they did. Nobody was under any doubt about what they were seeing and why they were paying attention to that. So it's quite a success.
Neil Stephenson wrote a great essay back when 300 came out that basically took to task all of the sneering laughter from much of the critical core regarding 300. Neil Stephenson, who has to be some sort of crypto-reactionary, is basically saying, like, you people out there, you writers and you intellectuals, you see 300 and you laugh at this idea of, sacrifice and believing in something more, and you think it's camp and you think it's, whatever. But there are a lot of people who this really speaks to and who take it seriously, who just take the ideas of the film seriously. So,
yeah, I think that's
Look it up. Look, it's on Google.
I didn't read it, but it makes a lot of sense. These movies wouldn't have an audience otherwise, and there's no getting around the fact that our military movies have turned into this sort of superhero form of storytelling that's best shown actually in the 300. That's not an accident either. Actually, people with their special forces, they're pretty much as superheroic as ancient soldiers were at their peak. There's a lot there about willingness to risk your life and supreme abilities of mental and physical kinds that go together in strange ways. It's just that Zack Snyder is the only guy who's really, really interested in how tragic this is and how interesting it is that there are human beings pushing their powers to the limits. It is the case that there's a preference in commentary for things like Marvel, where heroes always bicker, even if they're a team, and each one of them has his neuroses. And you feel like half the time Iron Man is looking for a shrink, maybe. I saw Captain America Civil War, which should be Iron Man 4, and he's going to work out his daddy issues with technology. They're not heroes, they're just boys with neuroses and too much power. Zack Snyder doesn't seem to believe that. He seems to think that they're grown men, and actually there are a lot of good reasons to try and be a hero if he possibly could. It's just not obvious that it's possible for most people. I think that's what made him the perfect director for Man of Steel, even if they didn't let him run as free as they should have with his technique, because he knows how to put it in service of this kind of storytelling. He's one of the guys that you could expect not to be ironic about Superman or not to laugh at it. As you put it, he's really serious about what if some of the things we wish for, what if we actually got it? And some of the stuff in Man of Steel must come from Nolan and David Goyer, who's also a really savvy writer. But Nolan clearly comes from an education in the classics, and his Batman movies are patterned on the Orestea tragedy of Aeschylus about how did the rule of law get installed in Athens. So also with this, how do you install the rule of law here? You start with corrupt cops, you end up with cops willing to sacrifice their lives. There's an arc there. So Man of Steel actually starts with the description that's book 8 of Plato's Republic, and you later see Clark Kent the boy with Plato's Republic in his hands. It's not like anybody would really believe that kids read philosophy. It's just a pointer to people. In book 8, Socrates explains that even if you could have utopian politics, you couldn't control genetics. And eventually everything would collapse. You couldn't breed enough superheroes.
Which is what happens on Krypton.
Exactly. There you see, we're tempted. I mean, partly because of our scientific powers, but partly simply because we're impatient with growing old and dying. You're tempted, what if we could have things perfect? Well, there's a name for that. It's Plato's Republic. There you see a beautiful city that's actually perfect. And you see that it would break down. And it's only in light of that then you can tell Superman's story, because Superman is no longer promising people that he'll lead them to that. He's not going to be saving people from every mistake and turning life into perfection to the point where nobody has any freedom anymore. He can't be that. Instead, he's got to be some kind of American kid and has this sort of Boy Scout education. But even there's something in Zack Snyder and in Nolan and the sort of storytelling they do that's really, really serious about what happens if you're playing with a lot of power. Superman's dad, in one of these silly moments, sacrifices his life to save a dog. That's Zack Snyder's way of saying God wouldn't care more about you than you do about a dog. It's that level of difference. Other people are like you, but if there were gods among us, they would be to you what you are to the dog. These are incredibly shocking things to tell an audience, especially nowadays. They're somewhat subtle, but they're there. Why would that guy commit suicide? Well, he wants to give an example to his son who's a god. You shouldn't be indifferent to people just because they're weak and maybe stupid. And at the same time, of course, his dad tells him to refrain from using his powers, which again is supposed to make sense for what America is like nowadays. Why not? If you're sure that your motives are pure, if you're acting out of righteous indignation, and you have the power to make things right, why not? Why shouldn't you do everything in your power to make everything right every time you get angry about some dangerous thing happening? Well, that's the high road to tyranny. Nobody's going to end up having any freedom, and nobody will ever be able to disagree with you. You have all the power. And of course, this is a problem not just for delusions of power on social media, but throughout American politics and society. It's really, really hard to say freedom has its rights even against moral indignation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an incredible achievement, even beyond thinking about what does it mean to have these super powerful beings who have to live with our problems but not with our limits. You begin to discover that there would be limits, and I think that if Dawn of Justice, Batman vs. Superman, hadn't been screwed over by the studio, as best I can tell, there was a lot there about, okay, how would politicians react to this? What would Congress do? What would corporations do, the other powers in our world, if they had to deal with creatures that seem to have no limits? It would create a real shock in society, because hierarchies would be upended. How would powerful people live if they're humiliated by this kind of comparison? Joe in the street might be satisfied because he's saved, but will every ambitious person or wannabe celebrity simply be satisfied to live in the shadow of Superman? So now you got a story, now you got a conflict that brings out stuff that's going on in us, but we don't have enough power to let those conflicts play out. But in the element of story, you could do that. There's, I think, a lot to recommend this kind of storytelling, and there is a broad criticism that doesn't see this, that prefers Marvel to DC. I think there are good reasons to do that. You might like a more comic touch. This criticism would broadly be said, why does everything have to be dark? Why does it have to be so gritty? Oh, people don't want yet another dark thing from Zack Snyder. Actually, all his movies were vastly successful. People did love this stuff. There was no reason to turn Justice League into literally a Joss Whedon movie. And to a large extent, they did that to Aquaman as well.
Yeah.
You could say that America is big enough that you could have both Marvel and DC. But people, including lots of critics, apparently can't think that that's possible. We cannot have both.
Yeah. I mean, it is... I at the risk of waxing philosophic, I like to think of what we do have instead of what we missed out on. I mean, I do think there's something to be said for the fact that, between the Dark Knight trilogy and 4.5 of the 5 DCEU films before Aquaman, you basically have a studio investing between all 8 of those movies something like, I don't know, $1.2 billion in terms of production and publicity and all that, in what are really very auteurist, very authorial statements in the guise of big budget filmmaking. I'm glad that we got what we got. It's too bad we didn't. We will probably never see what Snyder really wanted to do with Justice League. Because you can even sense it here and there in the bastardized version that we have. this idea that Justice League was essentially about continuing the idea of what would happen to a world with a Superman. The idea of Justice League is what would happen in a world where Superman suddenly vanished, where this person who everyone looked up to and who was making a difference in the world and who was making things better suddenly died and disappeared. What would happen to society? I think a real breakdown. A lot of hopelessness and a lot of aimlessness and a lot of despair. And I do think that again, you can see it mostly in the beginning montage that opens the film. And one thing Snyder has always done has had really great opening sequences to his films. Just talking about Justice League, but Batman vs Superman has the great Bruce Wayne bit watching Metropolis be destroyed. Before that, Man of Steel, the whole opening segment in Krypton, which is basically a 20-minute short film unto itself, is amazing. All the way back to Dawn of the Dead, which has the kind of you slowly see something is weird and happening, and then Sarah Polly walks out of her house and she does kind of this 270-degree spinning angle shot where she sees her peaceful street on fire with corpses running around and people driving over other people, and her neighbor has pulled a gun on her and she's like, what is going on? That is just he really and of course Sucker Punch, but we won't discuss that now. But but also and what I think was the subject we wanted to talk about today, Watchmen. The opening so after the fight between the comedian and his secret assailant, you get that great basically montage of tableaus that takes us through the kind of alternate history of the 20th century that Watchmen suggests. And it's really, it's just a incredible and very effective and what's the word I'm looking for here? Compressed piece of storytelling. Very much show don't tell. Very much look. You follow what has happened in the world, and I love that. And you were mentioning it before the show. If you want to talk about it now.
Yeah, I think it shows you what the change is in America as you put it in these tableaus. And this is typical of tragedy over comedy. Comedy requires timing. You do a setup and then you have a punchline. Tragedy works in spaces, in images that mesmerize you. You can't pay attention to details in any of these pictures unless the picture by itself shocks you and interests you. And it shows, as you said, an alternate history of America, but it's history made unusually interesting. It's what happens if the stuff that Americans dream of or stuff that happens in society becomes one individual's problem. It's not just something we all go through. What happens if it's embodied in a person? This is Tocqueville. He said that in the future you're not going to have all the myths you had in the past because nobody cares about all those fantastic hierarchies in the skies and the deep. What people care about is the future, and the future will be personalized in characters, and everybody will be interested for that reason. And that's what you see here with all these heroes, how America transformed, what the future looked like at different points in the 20th century. And it starts from something that's fairly homely and all-American. Heroes who stop bank robberies, vigilantes that act at a very small scale. Nevertheless, the seeds of great transformations are already there. Like the Night Owl stopping the murder of Bruce Wayne's parents. This story is not going to have a Batman, you're going to have Night Owl, who turns out to be a much more mundane character, because vigilantism is going to stop tragedies. You're not going to have this tortured boy turning his pain and fear into a great power. And you've got people stopping bank robberies, like that's how you introduce the comedian. That was banal storytelling even in comic books and the funnies before that. But it turns into hot babes that you'd expect to see at Radio Music City Hall or in the reviews, rather than flanked by cops who admire and approve them, to more versions of American freedom, like the famous VJ Day iconic picture of a sailor kissing a girl. In this case is a heroine kissing a girl. Sexual freedom is part of America's 20th century history. That's one way individualism transformed. But of course, in her case, it doesn't end well. Some nutcase murders these women in a later tableau. So you get to see changes, and it turns out that freedom doesn't always work out. You get to see with all of these things what happens after the pictures are taken too. You see the first Minutemen heroes who trace their name back to the founding wars. They don't end up so well. One of them just gets killed because his cape was caught in a door. That's a dumb, meaningless, ironic thing, but it's realistic in our world. Capes will slow you down. Mothman goes crazy, and here is where the tragic ironies start. The moth is drawn to the flame. Freedom could be self-destructive. If you chase it, you might chase it all the way to the asylum. And of course, madness is always part of our storytelling when it comes to heroes. It's always a temptation there. Deaths and madness, and it turns out that this story is not going to have a happy end. Heroism is essentially tragic. Maybe we don't pay enough attention to heroes as Snyder would want us to because we don't want to face that. Then there's a new lease on life, the 60s come along, and a whole new generation of heroes, and you see Dr. Manhattan show up. All of a sudden, Americans have among them a god, an indestructible being that can wield the powers of the universe, and there he is shaking hands with the president, there he is waving to Neil Armstrong on the moon. Changes have grown bigger all of a sudden because America changed something by creating the atomic bomb. Human beings before that didn't have the power to wipe out vast parts of the world, or indeed life as we know it. And now you see that heroism isn't necessarily a matter of choice anymore. It's driven by social changes, but also by technological changes. People are forced into this stuff whether they like it or not. Then there's this other strange character, Ozymandias, an American with the ambition to control the future. We're always in the business of rational control. On the left, people want more government because that's rational control, but on the right, people want more markets because that's rational control. You can only have heroes of the market like Steve Jobs or of government like FDR, I guess, if at the end of the day, there's less risk than at the beginning of the day. In the long run, everybody's more prosperous, more comfortable, safer. Heroes are always in the service of rational control. That's who Ozymandias is in the version of globalized capitalism. He has control over the media, he has control over billions of dollars of technology corporations, etc. because he's super smart but also incredibly beautiful. He's friends with David Bowie. There's this other kind of freedom, the ambiguous sexuality of Studio 54 in the tableau where we find him, and of course of disco. That's another part of America. The excitement you had in the beginning about heroes, that was simply somebody who's going to take care of our problems. There are injustices done, crimes, people are being dishonest, somebody's going to fix it. A basic understanding is going to be restored that we just want to go on with our lives. But that's not the end of it. Then two things happen. Everybody becomes individualistic, and even these heroes become ever more weird. But also, the country is going to war in Vietnam, and it's not like World War II anymore. We've gone from the good war to the bad war. It's no longer saving the world from Nazis. It's in the somewhat feverish left-wing imagination of Alan Moore, the guy who made the comic, wiping out Vietnam. And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. The power put into play in Vietnam is just inexplicable in relation to any political objective that Americans might approve of. So the country becomes corrupted. Instead of patriotism, which is what should follow from this idea that heroes just protect our honesty by helping fight injustice, we get cynicism and madness in increasing ways. And of course, this is also the time when society goes crazy and Rorschach appears. He's a creature of the era when America became liberated. Rorschach sees that we have worse problems than bank robbers. It's people who molest children. And that just makes him go crazy. So there's another impulse there to do justice. And it just gets more and more violent. And this leads to a future catastrophe of America. The country is divided against itself, and it doesn't look like the war against the Russians can end except in nuclear war. And that's the weird thing that heroism is supposed to reveal. People are kind of mad. You can't trust institutions enough that they will lead to a good outcome. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. It's weird to make this movie now, right? This was 2009, 10 years ago. We all know how the Cold War ended. It was actually fine. We didn't go crazy and kill each other or blow up the planet. But the truth is that the potential is there. That something in humanity has changed so that it's not just a fantasy story. These guys are onto something real because the powers that we're playing with now really are of a magnitude that has never been seen or imagined before. So you can create these new kinds of heroes and new kinds of gods because there are problems on a much larger scale. And all of that is just shown in 5 minutes and change in a montage that's supposed to announce to you what the hell is going to go on in this story.
Yeah.
It's breathtaking. There's nothing comparable to it in cinema in our times.
It's something else, and I have always thought that Snyder has gotten short shrift as a visual storyteller, just as somebody who can convey through imagery very basic but also important plot beats. Watchmen is a fascinating film for me because I have always gotten the sense that that Snyder looks at the heroes in this film. So, the idea of Watchmen, right, is that Alan Moore poses it as this deconstruction of the idea of superheroes, that you've got archetypes and they're all basically sick and wrong and bad. And Snyder, I don't know if he did this intentionally or not, but when you watch Watchmen, it is almost impossible to come away from it without thinking that he views all of these people as basically right, except for maybe the comedian. But basically, I think he is deeply sympathetic to Rorschach, whereas Moore is dismissive and thinks he's a crank. I think Snyder is deeply sympathetic to Ozymandias and the idea of trying to save the world, even through this immoral, horrible means. Part of the problem is that the medium of film. So Alan Moore was working with decades of superhero comics to break down and deconstruct, but really, Zack Snyder makes this movie about superheroes, and he has pitched it as this deconstruction or satire of superheroes, but he has made it before we really entered the golden age of superhero filmmaking, right? So yep. He's deconstructing a thing that hasn't yet been constructed, and because of this, he's just portraying archetypes. And because he's just portraying archetypes, it works much better as a pure superhero. It is the purest superhero movie that has been made, I think, in a very weird and strange way. It is not a deconstruction. It's actually a construction.
That's very true.
Like I said, he part of the problem with this is that the medium of filmmaking makes everyone who is supposed to look ridiculous in this movie actually look more heroic. So Rorschach is a dirty, disgusting, filthy, smelly person, right? In the comics, and you get a sense of that. You can almost see the stink lines coming off him when the cops swarm him in that apartment building. But when you watch the film, you know what you see? You see a guy doing extraordinary things in super slow motion, in a variety of hero poses, and it looks awesome. And because it looks awesome, your brain is like, wow, these guys are awesome. These guys are actually awe-inspiring figures. So it may just be a problem of transferring the story from one medium to another. But the way that Zack Snyder tells this story it makes it hard for me to think that this is really a satire or deconstruction. It really just feels like a straightforward superhero movie. And like I said, one of the better ones, one of the more interesting ones that we've had.
Yeah, you're right. This came out just a year before the first Iron Man, which really created the language of superheroes we have.
I think it came out the year after. So it came out in 2009.
Exactly.
And you had The Dark Knight and Iron Man both came out in 2008. So it's kind of, it's in a weird place, but it's basically right before the MCU kicks off in earnest and well before, Snyder's DC EU gets going. So it's in an interesting place in the comic book movie timeline.
Yeah, that's true. And most of the language of superhero movies relies heavily on visual gags with punchlines and on snappy dialogue and a lot of ridiculous stuff that you can do because it's superheroes, it's comics, and because we have the technology now that it looks plausible. And the superheroes are there to make it survivable. Not so with Watchmen. Here, indeed, everything seems to be played in earnest, straight up. As you said, these people are awe-inspiring. Something in movie making lends itself to tragedy and to heroism and to the sense that destiny is enacted on screen. It's not just some mistake that somebody slipped up on a banana peel or something to that effect. And so it becomes very, very easy to attach grand principles to persons. Watchmen has this vast array of characters that could all become the universe of superhero storytelling. As you said, it's rather than a deconstruction, it is the construction. It's the source for all of these things that could be done. Another very strange thing, there's no attempt to build towards a universe, to put many stories and franchises and businesses and schedules together. It's the opposite. Everything comes in at once.
Yeah, it's a standalone. I mean, you don't see a lot of standalone cinematic works anymore. I mean, even certainly not in the superhero genre. Everything is connected and everything is building to something else. Every movie is an ad for the next movie.
Yes, exactly.
And there is something refreshing about Watchmen being its own thing, which is again one of the reasons why it was so disappointing that DC decided to like sequelize the comic books and has been. I don't read superhero comics anymore, but I've been kind of keeping tabs on what they've been doing over there, and it sounds like it's just been a complete disaster. From what I've heard from everyone. So
wow.
And then you have the Damon Lindelof Watchmen HBO series coming up. Who knows what that is going to be like? I'm kind of fascinated. I'm kind of fascinated because I think you could, at this point in our history, at this point in our cinematic, exploits, there is a way to create a Watchmen adaptation that actually does serve as a deconstruction, and it is more in line with Alan Moore's original idea for what the series should be. But I'm also not somebody who is particularly interested in the author's own intent. So I don't really care if somebody messes with Alan Moore's work, because it's once you translation and transliteration are two different things, and I'm happy to see a translation much more than I would be a transliteration.
Yeah, Snyder managed to tell that story in a way that hopefully it will last. I think it will, and that's recognizably his. It adds up. He's not putting a veneer on somebody else's work, and that's a rare thing to do, to make it your own and do real storytelling out of it. Not to cut corners, not to skip over stuff or to get to the set pieces. Everything is so well put together in there, and of course it's a very long movie. Just hard to keep people's attention actually over such a long time, but I think superhero movies have trained audiences to sit in the theater for 3 hours.
Yeah.
Since The Dark Knight at least, and then up to Avengers Infinity War, yeah, they've been getting longer and longer, so I guess people would be even more inclined to watch all of Watchmen now than they might have been 10 years back.
Yeah, there's one of the nice things about home viewing is that you don't have to watch it all in one go, or at the very least you can take a short break to go to the bathroom or whatever. Amazon Prime actually for a while, before the end of the year, had all 3 versions of Watchmen available. I actually wrote a piece about this for Decider, but they had the theatrical cut, the director's cut, and there's a third even longer cut that works in the comic book, the pirate comic book that's like the comic within the comic, there's an animated version of that's spliced in with the film, and it's if you watch the version with the animated film intercut into it, you do get a little bit. I think it tips the film more toward being a critique of the characters within the film. It becomes a little bit less ambiguous that these are supposed to be considered kind of monstrous actions that are taking place. So it's one of the reasons I don't actually particularly like that cut. It tips its hand too hard. But it's interesting, like how many different versions of this movie that it was considered more or less a disappointment upon release. I mean, it definitely was not a big money maker, and I think some fans of the book were disappointed by some of the changes and the change to the ending. But it holds up very well. which is surprising for a movie as effects heavy as it is. It is very it's dependent on CGI in a way that often ages poorly. But I think this, because the way the CGI is used, especially with Dr. Manhattan, it creates kind of an otherworldly effect that puts it outside of time.
Yeah, I think you're right about this. Somehow they hit upon that thing. Of course, you're going to find it uncanny when you see the guy. If you get a good cinematic correlative of that, it could last. It's not going to be replaced by superior software. Maybe taste will change significantly, and in a generation, none of the superhero movies will look plausible, but I don't think so. Zack Snyder has another strange quality. As you said, he really is an artist, an author. You can see him everywhere in his movies. Not that he gets in the way of the storytelling, but just the way he tells the story, it's his way. And it's also uniquely close to computer games that are also getting far more storyfied and far more sophisticated and invested in this idea of, are heroes tragic or mad? And is there a difference? There may be a future in this, and I'm not as curious about seeing a series on Watchmen, but if somebody were to make this into some kind of computer game, that may be interesting.
Yeah, that would be kind of amusing. Do you imagine if you were Dr. Manhattan as a character, you could just you could end the whole thing in about 2 minutes. Yeah. It would probably be overpowered, but
Yeah, that's the very definition. I wonder what you do with that. The story has a plot, so you can handle that. I don't know how you would translate that. Again, I mean, there's nothing TV can do for this, but a game would have to find a mechanical version to tell you what does it mean that you really believe in causality to the point that you have no personal freedom of action.
Yeah.
If you think this is how things turn out, why bother? You're caught in a chain of consequences that you didn't start and that you cannot end. I'm not sure how you translate that, but it's an interesting thing that games are concerned with.
Yeah, no, it would be hard to do. I mean, you would have to play as the only character it would make sense to play as is probably Rorschach, since he's the one who is actually, the story kind of revolves around him solving the mystery, and at the end he's the only one who was able. I often argue this, and people, think I'm just trolling, but Rorschach really is the only moral character in Watchmen. He's the only one who looks at what Adrian Veidt has done and finds it correctly to be monstrous.
Yeah, he's a fanatic of justice. That's one thing we really look for in our heroes, because we know in reality you're going to have to deal with what happens and live with what you can get and not be fanatic about justice. He's the guy who would sacrifice for a political cause. I don't mean a political cause in the everyday Twitter sense. I mean really believing that the basis of politics is justice.
Right.
And I think that's what also makes him quite compelling as a character. Otherwise, investment in morose reactionaries is not grand to judge by our entertainment, but this guy gets it across very well, partly because Jackie Earle Haley pulls a great performance, but partly it's just the character. And I think that's what you get out of earnestness. If you want to compare it with something done badly, that's Black Panther. Black Panther bet on the fact that what American audiences really want is the most simplistic, moralistic story ever told, where the hero is morally pure and indestructible at the same time. So there's no price to pay for being moral. By the way, they're right. I mean, he has no personal flaws of any kind whatsoever. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, I'll disagree here slightly insofar as I think that Black Panther was interesting because it is the only Marvel movie that had a good villain. Somebody who you could actually, who made a case for what he wanted to do, and what he wanted to do was something beyond, oh, I want to take over the world, or oh, I want to destroy the planet, or oh, I want to make some money. It was like he had an actual ideological grievance that he tried to settle via fisticuffs.
Yep, I agree.
I think Black Panther is not. Black Panther is not even the best Marvel movie released this year. That was probably Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, but of the MCU movies, it is I think one of on the upper end of entertaining.
Yeah, I agree about that, and I agree about the villain, and Michael B. Jordan, who played him, who's been acting in Ryan Coogler's movies since he was doing indie stuff, is quite a talent. I'm glad to see him do that role. It's the protagonist that I was training my fire on.
Oh yeah.
And I think that there's something to that even Marvel feels they need to go that way. You also look at Avengers Infinity War, which should have been called Thanos the Tragedy,
Yes.
and which retells that's the setting of the Agamemnon tragedy, that you have to sacrifice your daughter to achieve the thing that has to be done. That's exactly what Agamemnon does in the Greek myth. And I'm glad to see this done. It's by no means a criticism on my part. Whenever somebody turns a tragedy into a superhero movie, he's got my money. I'm super interested in this. And the part that is about Thanos is actually strangely persuasive.
The best part, Infinity War. I argued this in my review, but I think Marvel really copped out by trying to make this an Avengers movie instead of just a Thanos movie. It should have just been called Thanos.
Yep.
Just like like Thor or Captain America, or Iron Man, just Thanos. Because everything about him is interesting. All of the emotional beats surrounding him are interesting, and frankly, they're the only real emotional beats in the film, except for Spider-Man thinking that Tony Stark is his dad. Yep. But the all of the stuff with Thanos is good. All the stuff with Gamora is great. It's really a much better Guardians of the Galaxy film than an Avengers film. It should have been Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Everything about the framing of that movie is wrong in ways that anger me, because the rest of the movie is, as a piece of filmmaking, it is a weird summation / meta movie. It is a weird attempt to sum up 20 years of filmmaking in 2.5 hour movie. And because of that, it doesn't actually work as a standalone film, but it could have very easily. You could have very easily made it it's the Thanos movie. This is Thanos. And it would have been so much better. But
I completely agree. I think that to some extent the success of superhero movies should teach people that you can give into the dark side now and then. Just make a straight up tragedy, or as close to a noir with superheroes as we can get. Because everybody can notice immediately that this guy is simply impossible to take your eyes off of. And you know that nothing good can come of this, but nobody's going to leave their seat. Nobody's going to stop the movie. It's just, he's amazingly captivating. And it turns out that you can turn away from all the quipping, all the sarcasm, all this patter that's typical of the MCU, and nobody's going to complain. Nobody's going to mind. Everybody will throw every last dollar at you. So I think that a lot of the delusions people have about what Marvel movies really are, or about superhero movies really are, whether they love or hate them, have been disproven to an extent by the grand success in different ways of Black Panther and this Thanos movie. Whether anybody learns anything from this or it was just a flash in the pan, I don't know. It's tricky to talk about the business, just like we said about Watchmen. Kind of a flop. People lost money on that. Nobody's going to do that again. Great movie, better than all of this other stuff, but it should have been a hit as well, or else no lessons are going to be learned, so to speak. Nobody's going to try something like this again. And maybe they wanted to hedge their bets on making a movie about this big monster who wants to kill lots of people, starting with his daughter. That's not going to sell, people think, or they can't get their minds around why it would. But obviously, audiences loved it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, far be it from me to criticize Marvel. They seem to know what they're doing in terms of creating satisfying and financially remunerative features. But I still can't help but feel that there was a slight missed opportunity there. I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree. One hopes that these things can somehow get better, but they hedge on these things always in the same direction. You don't want to startle your audience. You want to make sure that they'll have that good feeling, that they'll be amused. I think that's probably a wrong idea, at least because Marvel has done such a good job that everybody knows what their movies are. Everybody's in love with them. It's not just that Zack Snyder didn't end up making Justice League all the way through, but they replaced him with Joss Whedon, Mr. Avengers. Marvel has won even in DC. At some point, you just have to take your victory and not obsess over branding anymore, I think. This was a great opportunity for that. It would have been quite a chance to let people see the other stuff. It's always been there in Marvel movies. So in America, if you don't go to church, you could watch a Marvel movie instead, because at the end, a bunch of heroes will be Jesus for you. They'll sacrifice, they'll die, and then they'll be resurrected for your sins. In Guardians of the Galaxy, all the Guardians do it. In the second Guardians movie, they have even more Guardians to do it. Right? Even Deadpool does it. I saw this, I was shocked. At the end of the Deadpool 2 movie, the boy actually looks at Deadpool and says, "You sacrificed yourself for me, Deadpool." I thought we were doing a hardcore, filthy, R-rated movie here. Turns out it's a sentimental tearjerker about Jesus. That's great. I guess it's great, but it's not what people think it is what I'm trying to get at.
Sure.
There's far more pathos in these things than people are willing to admit. Maybe, now that Marvel simply owns the American imagination about heroes, they'll do more daring things. 2017 and 2018 have been better signs in that direction. I have no idea what's coming next, but I think it's an improvement.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. I don't want to predict the future.
That's safe. So, one reason I wanted to do this is because it was the 10th anniversary of Watchmen this year. Another is because I have no idea either about the future of Zack Snyder, but I do think he's a great artist, and he's shown what you could do if you have a vision and technical control of it in a new genre, and he's an amazing guy. So, thanks a lot for joining me. It was a pleasure talking to you, and let's everybody watch Watchmen all over again.
Thanks for having me on.
All the best.
Yeah.